Commutify presents Between the Lines with Andy Keaton. Each week, we explore the challenging issues transportation demand management professionals face on their journey to transition commuters from driving alone to more sustainable, shared, and active commuting habits. Be sure to subscribe to hear next week's episode and check out our exclusive commuter playlists on Spotify. This is Between the Lines with Andy Keaton.
Hi, everyone, and welcome on board to Between the Lines. Today, we're talking with Kaite Justice, the director of CityGo, which is downtown Boise's Transportation Management Association, or TMA. I recently learned it's Boise, not Boise. Is that right, Kaite?
That is correct.
Perfect. All right, I got it right this time. So Kaite has been working in transit for the past 5 years and has overseen a variety of transportation initiatives, from refugee job access programs to integrated fare payment systems to developing the first TMA in Idaho. Amazing. She serves on ACTS, or the Association for Commuter Transportation, their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, the Pacific Intermountain Parking and Transportation Association's Education and Training Committee, and is the transportation co-chair for the Neighbors United Refugee Collaborative of Boise, which is awesome. So she's bringing a wealth of knowledge. She also has a master's degree from the University of Washington in sustainable transportation and is a Boise native, so she knows what she's talking about when she's talking about how to pronounce Boise. Thanks for being on, Kaite. It's really good to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about, I think, a really interesting, particularly salient conversation. We're talking about why TDM for refugee communities will help save the planet. So we're getting, maybe this is going to be a little bit more in the weeds than some of our other conversations, but I think it's going to be really interesting. And it's going to piggyback off some of your research. So we're going to start off just talking about what you've learned from your research in a mid-sized refugee resettlement city. So I guess before we get into that, I think the key here is, can you tell us a little bit more about how climate change is going to impact the global, or already is impacting the global refugee population, maybe differently than the rest of us?
Sure. Yeah. And that's a really big, wide scale question. So I'll be real brief on that. But currently there is 79.5 million refugees or displaced persons worldwide. That's 1% of the global population. Now, climate change currently isn't necessarily leading to refugees. However, it's a risk multiplier in countries because you get famine and drought and all of the other really awful impacts that climate change can have on vulnerable communities, which exacerbates conflict and will likely lead to higher numbers of refugees in the future. So, for example, right now, 7 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries for climate change already have peacekeeping operations on the ground, right? So they're already rife with conflict. And then the contributors to climate change make that a higher risk. So it's kind of feeding the cycle, right? The more we play into emissions in the transportation sector, and the worse we make climate change, likely the higher number of refugees we are going to see worldwide, which means there's going to be more people that need resettled in countries like the United States, cities like Boise, and then you have a lot of local issues on the ground that make that resettlement difficult, which is a lot of what we'll talk about today.
Yeah, I think that's a critical, an important umbrella to keep in mind here, that just like a lot of things, climate change has maybe a disproportionately large impact on the refugee communities. And now people are having to move places. They're new. There's a lot of things going on. I think let's get into your research here. One of the, I'm assuming, big things that comes in the way of refugees is we have a housing crisis almost, I don't know, probably in every city in the United States. So how has this housing crisis impacted transportation accessibility specifically for the refugee communities and populations?
Yeah, it's impacted it quite a bit. And while we're looking specifically at Boise, it's a really good case example for around the country, right? We are experiencing the housing crisis, just like so many other cities. Our affordability has significantly decreased. So in Boise, we have really high demand for housing. We have a lot of people moving here and there's low supply. So the housing median just in the last year has gone up 25%. And supply of housing from 2019 to or 2020 to 2021 has gone down 80%. So there's very few houses.
Oh.
They're unaffordable and they're not available. And then you look at vulnerable populations coming in, like refugees resettling. They're on a fixed stipend for their first 3 months. They have no credit history. They don't have a job when they walk in the door. They don't have their social security card yet. And so it becomes very difficult to place them in this type of housing market. So you're looking at placing people farther and farther out of the core of the city, and usually the core of transit, which makes access difficult, whether it's jobs, healthcare, groceries, etc. And so in our this research we did, we wanted to take a closer look at that. And so what we did was we took all of the housing placements, initial housing placements for refugee from back in 2005 all the way through 2020. And we did a GIS mapping and analysis of that in conjunction with job accessibility. And in short, what we found was that there's a 30% variable in a downward trend. So from 2005 to 2020, just based on housing location, access to transit has decreased by 30% for refugee populations. And in kind of the same note, walkability is decreased by 49%. So it shows us that it's a very real problem, and housing is playing a really significant factor in that ability to access just basic needs and jobs for this population.
I mean, those are pretty big stats. Thanks for sharing those. I think I'll play devil's advocate. I'm guessing the people in the TDM community might already know this answer, but presumably then there's this huge crisis, this transportation inaccessibility crisis. So refugee communities must have some sort of good say, you would assume, or should have a say in the transportation planning process. What is your research pointing to? What kind of say, if any, are refugees having in this?
There's not a lot, or very little, maybe none, depending on how you want to phrase that. And it's not necessarily from lack of effort on the planner side. There's a lot of barriers that get in the way. One is language and culture, right? Most refugees that arrive do not speak English. A large percentage, especially of the women, are illiterate in their own languages. And things like surveys are culturally strange to them, right? And most cultures, people don't just ask for a bunch of personal information and you share it. That's a bit suspicious. So it's really difficult to engage. And a lot of times in planning, people don't make the extra effort. We did, for this research, do a survey. We translated it into different languages, and we worked with community advisors or important people in the different refugee groups to disperse the survey, and we got a pretty good turnout that way. But right now there is no voice, and when there is any sort of input, it's at the very end of the planning process, right? So it's really to check that box versus getting into what the really issues are and planning around equity and access for vulnerable populations.
Sure. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I think touching on the language and the cultural barriers, I think language makes sense. That's obvious, but the cultural barriers of surveying and things like that, that's not something I necessarily thought of. I think that's important to keep in mind if we're for our transit planners as you're kind of starting this process. And we're going to get into some of the things that maybe you can recommend as actions that could be taken. But I do have one more question.
Yeah.
You mentioned folks are moving further and further out from the core of the city, less walkable, less transit accessibility. So how does this kind of lack of, I guess, how does the lack of maybe inner city or inner county transit for these further out populations impact the economic self-sufficiency that these communities maybe can or can't have?
Yeah, it impacts, it can have a large impact both on kind of the economic self-sufficiency side, job access, but also the social side, right? It can lead to a
Sure.
lot of isolation as well. So you usually in a metropolitan area, you have one city that may have the majority of jobs, right? Or higher paying jobs. And that's usually not the same place where the more affordable housing is. So you have people living out on one end, you have more of the jobs on the other end, and there's no transit connections in between, or very few, which is the case in Boise, in the Boise area. Then it cuts all of those options off, right? That's something we're dealing with here too, just English language classes, case management services, all of those initial wraparound services for refugees are in Boise proper. However, the housing's not there. So then you have issues like, oh, do I take these buses and I spend 2 hours to get to an appointment? That's all I can do the whole day. It makes it very difficult to access basically just the normal things that we take for granted on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's another important point. Is it's hard to be an active member of a community if you can't actually access the aspects that make you part of that community. Okay, so we have established, I think, pretty well that there is a problem here in transportation among refugee communities. I know we could keep talking about this, I think, for hours longer, but let's keep it short and brief. But let's move into how we can actually then make our transportation networks more equitable and accessible. You had kind of mentioned before we got on this podcast that you have some ideas. I think in your research, there's some key actions you can point to that maybe we can take to improve accessibility. So let's dive into those. One of the things that I think is at the core of this is maybe the community-centric planning. And can you tell us a little bit about what that is maybe, and then how it can play a role in making transportation more equitable?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it really is kind of what it sounds like, and it's involving the community more from planning at the beginning, right? You have in traditional planning, you have kind of triggers where you take plans to the public. You have public comment. You may do surveys, and it's towards the end, right? You may have already done 18 months worth of planning. So if there's no big issue, you're probably moving forward with this plan. With
Right.
community-centered, right? It's true. But with community-centered planning, you're really intentionally planning for vulnerable populations and all people from the beginning. So you're going about your planning process with an equity lens. So equity and access are really at the forefront rather than throughput, right? We put a transit line here, this is where we're going to get the highest numbers, versus if we put a transit line here, we're going to reach a higher number of people who don't have access to a vehicle or of a minority or low income population. And having that regular engagement, that could be through an equity steering committee. It could be done through focus groups. It could be done through more reachable translated surveys. There's a lot of different approaches that you can take, but it really is involving those vulnerable populations in the planning process, because us as professionals, we have a lot of experience, but we also don't know what we don't know, right? We don't necessarily know what the true needs of a group of people are unless we talk to that group of people about their perspective and experience and needs.
Yeah, I mean, super important. Including people from the beginning makes perfect sense. It seems like a great great
It's
idea.
simple.
Okay,
We can
so
all implement it now.
right, okay, it's done. We figured it out. Okay, but obviously we didn't yet. There's more to it. We've included the community. We have this community-centric planning. Okay, this is gonna be a big question. I'm gonna combine two questions, I think, into one. Now that we know that we need to include the community, there's more to it. What should we be focusing on kind of when trying to improve transit accessibility? And then what kinds of projects then should we be funding to, once again, improve transit accessibility?
So I don't think there's one answer to that question. I think it's a toolkit of a lot of different approaches, right? At
Yep.
the end of the day, transit I feel is most important, right? You have lots of other gap filling services which are very important and very important in the short term, like shuttles, late night service, but at the end of the day, to really create a sustainable transportation infrastructure in a city, you need fast, reliable transit that's available lots of places and available late in the day. So the biggest thing is investing in more transit and less in kind of more auto-centric infrastructure. So that's number one. Number two is working on a lot of those projects and programs, and we have several in Boise that fill the gap in the meantime, right? Transit's not a quick turnaround to build transit, right? That sometimes takes years, decades in the making to build transit out in a city. So late night services, shuttle programs, sometimes adaptable van pools that fit lower income population needs are all good projects to focus on. And then another big one that came out of our survey, which was really interesting because it wasn't necessarily something on our radar, is increasing walkability infrastructure, which a lot of those things can be done fairly quickly and fairly cheaply. One of the questions we asked on our survey was, do you feel safe using public transit? Like, yes or no. 30% of people said they did not feel safe using public transit. And we asked a follow-up question of what made them feel unsafe. And every single, I think it was like 98% of that 30% said it was because of walkability, lighting at the bus stops, past home, having to walk in a high traffic area without sidewalks or lighting late at night, getting home late at night. And so that's wasn't something on our radar, but it was something that's highly impacting this community's ability to use transit. And it's something that's not a difficult thing to improve. So that's another piece. And that's why that community-centric planning is so important, because that's not something on our own we ever would have seen as a priority to improve transit accessibility for our refugee population.
Yeah, I think you touched on a few key points there from I guess from like the TDM transportation demand management side is transit as the core. Duh, makes a ton of sense. Like I just moved to Montreal in the city here. It's great transit and it makes everything way more accessible and even out further from the city core. But then, yeah, you can't just do that overnight. So we have all these other kind of stopgap solutions. But the walkability that's, I think, such a key point. And I agree, easy to do. I think that's good information to have. And the key from this is that you used like actual outreach and data to figure this out. Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming other cities that are looking at doing this, improving transit accessibility and equity, maybe they could take some of these and do this exact same thing in their cities, but presumably there's other things. So how does this outreach and data collection help? Like how important is it to do this, what you've done, and really ask people and really get at the core of the problem to figure out what to do?
I mean, it's essential, right? I mean, we often have good intentions, I would say, in any industry, right? And we have good
Hmm.
intentions, we make assumptions, we can build beautiful programs. But at the end of the day, if they don't actually fit the needs of who you're trying to serve, they're going to be nothing more than a beautiful theory that never goes well implementing. And so, collecting that data, talking to people, talking to the diverse populations is critical in really moving the needle in TDM, right? We want to get more people out of cars. We want to have more sustainable, um, larger transportation infrastructure. And we have to do that through reliable data and information and lived experiences.
Yeah. And it's a leading question. I love data. I think I ask almost everyone, how important is data? And it's always very important.
Very important.
But it is, it really is. Okay, cool. We are cruising through this conversation. I think it's good. I mean, we're sharing a ton of information. So we've identified a problem. We said, here's some things that you can do. Now, what is the impacts? Like, what does this do? So let's dive a little bit in. Our last kind of, I guess, topic to focus on is how can creating this sustainable transportation network that's equitable and accessible to everyone, how can this help us with mitigating climate change and the impacts there?
I mean, the more desirable and usable your sustainable transportation network is, the more likely people are going to use it. And I am a big advocate for planning for the most vulnerable populations, right? If we plan our transit in a city to meet the needs of the people that have no other options to really be able to live their life, get places quickly and efficiently, and take away those transportation barriers, we're going to build an awesome system that's usable across the board, and more people are going to choose to use it that don't have to use it. And obviously, the more people we get walking, biking, transit, van pool, carpool, the more impact we're having on reducing emissions, which has a positive impact on climate change mitigation, which on then a large scale can help potentially reduce the number of new refugees in the future.
Yeah, cycle. I mean, it makes sense. Okay, and then we're trying to actually, we're solving a problem here for a particular population. So how does, once again, this equitable and accessible transportation, how does that help the refugee community achieve this kind of self-sufficiency that we mentioned is lacking in a lot of cases right now?
It gives them the tools to rebuild their life, right? I mean, refugees are probably one of the most vulnerable populations in the US. They've literally had their lives destroyed, had to flee their country, and are now having to completely rebuild in a new culture, a new place. And at the end of the day, most of them, that's exactly what they want to do. They don't want to be a burden on anyone. They want to build their lives, get back to their careers and jobs. And having reliable transit that's not a barrier to them allows them to find um, decent jobs, access medical care, integrate socially, and really build a life and be a productive member of a new community.
Yeah, and wow, you sell it well. Listening to it, I'm like, wow, we need to get you talking to the government officials across the country.
Who do
This
I need
is
to talk
such an
to
important
solve
thing,
this problem?
transportation. It's true. Okay, and then the last question is, I think what's maybe even really exciting beyond that is that creating this transportation system that is here to help refugee communities can actually help a lot more people. So, how does this help overall equity in our cities for kind of all vulnerable populations beyond maybe just the refugee communities?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we are looking at kind of a microcosm of how this impacts refugees. But at the end of the day, most of the barriers that refugee face, other populations face, right? Low income individuals, persons with disabilities, oftentimes seniors who no longer can drive. And so, again, by kind of figuring out what these barriers are and then being adaptable and flexible to start finding real world solutions, we're going to build something that works better for everyone, both our vulnerable populations and everyone else as well.
It's so good. I feel like you have given us such a good summary of every little point. But this is how we do things. We always have a final question here where we have to really summarize this because we have talked about a lot. So even though I think you've done a really good job of summarizing it down. Let's do it even more. Let's distill this down into just a few sentences. How can TDM for refugee communities really help save the planet?
It can save the planet by focusing in on equity and access and planning and creating transportation options that are equitable, accessible, reliable, safe, and sustainable. And if we do that, we're going to, that's like such a huge thing. But if we do that, and start making progress in those areas, we're going to be able to mitigate a lot of the transportation impacts of climate change, and provide a safe space for some of our most vulnerable populations in the world.
Yeah, well said. I have nothing to add. I mean, Katie, this is a great conversation. I think a really important conversation to have. I really hope that our listeners and our viewers can take this, whether you are a city planner and you're thinking about this, or you can take it to your cities. Start thinking about this because it's an important conversation to have, and really we need to be having it right now. So, once again, to everyone listening and watching, thank you for tuning in. If you haven't yet, make sure to give us a like and a follow and a rating on wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you haven't, tune into our video on YouTube. It's fun to watch. The conversations happen. You actually put a face to the voices, and you can see random people walking behind me in my WeWork office here. So it gives you something to be distracted on, I guess. But yeah, this has been a really great conversation. If you want to learn more about this conversation and future conversations, go to betweenthelines.io and subscribe to our email list, and we send out some information about each episode. Katie, it's been wonderful having you on. We have one final question. We've been building this playlist of songs and podcasts to just keep people occupied on their commutes. Most people probably aren't finished with their commute yet. What are we at? 27 minutes. So maybe a couple more minutes left in your commute. So you might have to buffer that with something else. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Any good songs or podcasts you want to throw on the playlist?
Yeah, and I don't know if this one's already on your playlist because it is a transportation related podcast as well. But one of my favorites to listen to is War on Cars, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? All the ways that our cars are trying to kill us and are bad for us. But no, it's really interesting. It's a journalist and advocates of biking, walking, and sustainable transportation. And they take on everything from weird incidences at public hearings to some of the historical inequities in our transportation infrastructure and everything in between. So it's a great listen if you're interested in sustainable transportation.
It's great. I know it's not on somehow. So thank you for adding it. It's a really good podcast. I've listened to a couple episodes, take inspiration from it for ours, and maybe one day we can have interesting of conversations. This one was a great one, though. Katie.
I was going to say, don't listen to War on Cars,
Exactly.
though, if you're offended by profanity, because it's got that in there. So that's your That's your PSA about it.
Well, you can't have a war on anything without a little bit of profanity, right? So I think it's great. Katie, thanks for being on. This was a great conversation. Everyone, thanks for listening. And we will certainly be watching what you're doing at your TMA in Boise, and excited to hear you talk more and see your face everywhere, pushing this agenda. It's great. Thanks for being on.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode of Between the Lines with Andy Keaton. Be sure to subscribe to hear next week's episode and check out our exclusive Commuter playlists on Spotify.